The morning opened like a slow breath over the hills of Canaan. Dew silvered the grass, and the ground still remembered the cool of night. The air trembled with small sounds, flocks stirring, fires whispering, a child's laugh lost among the tents. Sunlight gathered at the horizon, and from the quiet hum of the camp, a figure stepped into that rising gold. His robe caught the light first, threads of red and gold and blue and green shimmering as if dawn itself had chosen a place to rest. Joseph moved through the cool air as someone who loved morning for its simple gifts, the smell of bread from a flat stone, the soft weight of a jar still holding the night, the way sheep folded into one another like clouds finding their shape. From the shade Jacob watched, hands wrapped around warm clay, the old ache of decision stirring under his ribs. He had given that robe not to set one son above the others, but because a love that had long been starved finally found a way to speak. He knew how a gift can offend those who stand outside its circle. He had seen the flicker of concern in certain faces, had heard the hollow in certain voices, yet the gift remained. Love, when honest, asks to be clear, and clarity leaves a mark. Work began to pull the camp forward. Men lifted staffs and set gates swinging. Dogs trotted like thoughts along the flock's edge. Hooves thudded the earth and softened into dust. Joseph joined first in the small ways that ask for no permission, easing a stuck knot, guiding a lamb that could not find the gap, carrying water to the men who waited. He moved lightly, eager to belong, and yet the robe made belonging look like a kind of difference that no effort could erase. Lately he had been dreaming. The visions did not come like sudden storms, but like weather that has been gathering for days. In one, the field stretched wide under wind that wrote script no hand could hold, and his sheaf stood while the others bowed without compulsion. In another, the sky grew full of lights, and those lights leaned near. He spoke of these things because wonder in him refused secrecy. He did not point to himself. He only set the images in the air, and they settled on every face. The brothers listened with the kind of silence that ripens toward hardness. They stored the words in the rooms where envy grows its own logic. Evenings found Jacob asking for reports, pasture depth, and old cistern levels, the temper of a hireling no one trusted yet. Joseph often carried the answers because he was already near when questions were shaped. Nerness turned to evidence and evidence to grievance. The colored edge of his robe began to measure the day like a clock in cloth. Men who had once smiled at the way the colors chased sun now looked away or looked too long and said nothing. Night pressed its darker skin over the camp, and the noises went small. Joseph lay awake beneath a roof on which stars made tiny holes, counting the beats between cricket calls. The dream returned, not as pictures, but as weight. He could not say what it meant, only that it pointed toward something steadier than the world as it stood. In the gray before the next morning, he carried bread to the herdsmen and spoke carefully, saying only that he had seen the field again, and a bowing sky, and a kind of order that did not come from force. He kept his own name out of it, but the brothers found him there anyway. Reuben turned away to untangle a foot in brush. Simeon looked to Levi, and the glance struck like flint. Judah measured cost without moving his face. Then it was time for an errand that families require if they are to live. Jacob told Joseph to go to Shechem, to find the brothers, to bring word back. He added a narrow caution that sounded like any father's wisdom. Some truths attract trouble. Not every ear is safe for holy things. Joseph tied his sandals and took his staff. He stepped between tamarisks into open ground, where the earth moved in long swells, the sun lifting in deliberate patience. He met a woman at a water place and shared bread, took a drink when she nodded, thanked her with a tilt of his head. The dust carried the scent of old fires. Near Dothan, a man who knew the land asked whom he sought. Joseph named his brothers without complaint, and the man pointed north and returned to his work. From a ridge, the brothers saw the mark of color before they saw the boy. The coat announced him like a pennant that needed no wind. Words moved in halves between men, the younger drawn to quickness, the older letting calculations slow the blood. A choice gathered itself the way a storm gathers under a false blue. Joseph came with the ease of someone who expects welcome. He lifted a hand and let it fall when no hand rose to meet it. He reached for a dog that stepped back into its master's shadow. Wrongness slid beneath his skin before thought could name it. The first hand took his shoulder. The second reached for the robe, because symbols are easier to strike than bodies. Cloth tore with a sound that felt older than fabric. He fell hard, grit pushing into his teeth, breath clawing in his chest. His name was thrown like something to be driven out. When the dust settled, the robe lay twisted, a bright flag lowered without ceremony. He stood bare-shouldered and looked younger than he had an hour before. The well waited near, a dry throat cut into earth, its walls rough enough to skin a palm, its floor as unforgiving as old bone. They argued without truth's names until Reuben's voice tied them back from a pit they could not climb out of. Blood stains more than ground, anger can be contained by time. A pit would hold what fury wanted to end. It was enough to pull them back an inch. They shoved him to the edge, and he fell through light into stone, pain flaring sharp, sky shrinking to a coin. He called twice and listened to the well, gave him back a thin, wrong echo. He pressed his palms to the wall and felt a ghost of water in the stone. He thought of bread still warm at dawn, of wool under his cheek as a child, of his father's hand, steady and heavy. Prayer rose without words because breath was costly. Memory lined itself up like a procession so his name would not drift away. A small spider crossed the ragged lip of rock and slid into a crack. He watched it and felt steadied by that unnecessary life. Above, the brothers ate. Bread tore and a jug passed, and relief breathed in men who believed they had already paid their price. Heat thickened, time lengthened, and then bells came thin on the air. A line of camels traced the ridge and voices followed, words stitched with spice. The traders moved with the indifference of people used to walking through other people's stories. Judah found a road in their arrival. Better to sell than to kill. Silver buys silence. Blood does not dry. Agreement came quick. They hauled Joseph up, rope burning his wrists. For the length of a heartbeat, he believed they were rescuing him. But faces held their new shapes. Reuben was not there. Judah's gaze did not flinch. Simeon's jaw locked. Levi's hands stayed too still. Coins changed hands with the small weather of metal on skin. The rope transferred to another palm, and the caravan turned its face toward the east. He did not cry out. He would not gift them that sound. He walked as rope and sand decided, the robe left behind like a shed skin. In time, Reuben came back and found absence. The sound that left him had no word. He took a torn edge of cloth because nothing else could be taken. A plan was spoken without ceremony. A goat's life ended, and the robe drank that life. Color hid and returned darker. Evening leaned long across the land as they walked home. The camp lifted its face like a field expecting rain, and met a silence that held knives. They did not wash. They set the garment in Jacob's hands, where it would cut deepest. He read the weave as if it held a message carved by grief itself. Pain wrote its name into his chest, and he answered by tearing his clothes and covering his head with ash. Comfort stood at the door of a room that would not open. Night sat down among the tents. Women moved with quiet hands. Children froze mid-step and learned stillness they should not have learned. Servants lifted their eyes and set them down again. The brothers stood heavy at the edge of what they had made, kept there by their own feet. Jacob's voice rose and fell until sound itself grew tired. When exhaustion came, it was only pause. Benjamin folded himself near a wall. He understood nothing a man could explain, only absence, and absence moved into him like an uninvited guest. Meanwhile, the desert kept its prayer. Camels rose and set their feet, as if walking were a long obedience. Joseph's wrists burned under rope, and sweat drew small roads down his back. He learned the stride of each guard, the creak of leather, the music of talk he did not understand. Dusk painted the dunes violet, and then erased them. Stars laid a net over the sky and let it hold. Small mercies arrived thin but real. A knot eased at dusk, a cup filled a finger higher, a boy's grin given freely. He gathered these as stones for an altar that no one else would ever see. In the deep middle hours, he pressed his bound hands to his cheek and told the God of his fathers, with no sound at all, that breath still moved. He asked for no map and offered only pulse. The confession itself became strength. They passed places that belonged to no tribe, only to wind. Shrubs kept their green tight at the center, a lesson in survival. At a wadi, they rested where water sometimes remembered itself. Firelight placed gold on faces and left the rest to the night. Someone played a reed flute, and the thin music braided with starlight until sleep came. Dreams were quieter now, stripped of grandeur but not of truth, a sense of being held by something that did not let go. Days repeated with small variations, and Joseph learned to carry each mercy forward to pay for the next hour. At times a man who had not spoken to him before pointed out a hawk circling and then dropping like a thrown knife. At times bread was cut thicker and pressed into his hands with eyes turned elsewhere to protect the giver's pride. At times a boy copied the way he wrapped cloth at his wrist and grinned without reserve, and Joseph kept that grin like a coal against cold. In Canaan, work kept knocking. Water must still be drawn, wounds checked, children gathered at dusk. Jacob moved through each task as a man wades through deep water, every step heavy and necessary. The robe stayed near, folded then unfolded, fingers tracing where goat's blood had darkened thread. He thought of God and did not curse. He gave thanks for small things, a post under his palm, thin light at morning, the echo of a laugh that refused to die. Gratitude did not erase grief, but it taught grief how to breathe. On the third week, sand shouldered out soil and the horizon straightened into a held breath. The wind lifted thin sheets of dust and laid them down like pages. The traders spoke of the river before it appeared, of green that would cut through gold, of cities that gleamed even after the sun left. Joseph felt expectation move like current through men who did not use the word hope. They crossed a shallow channel in the cool hour and climbed a low ridge. From there he saw not the river itself, but its proof, a ribbon of trees in a place where trees had no business, birds flickering above like thrown sparks. The air sweetened with water's generosity. The camels quickened as if their bodies remembered what their minds had never forgotten. The road changed underfoot. Stone had been laid here because power wanted it. Wheels had drawn arcs into the rock and left them for others to follow. People collected into clusters. Some carried tools toward fields. Some wrapped themselves in linen that rejected dust. Some walked as if their task were only to be seen. The city swallowed arrivals without changing its mouth. The gate did not boast. It simply stood open between towers that had outlived the memory of the men who raised them. Sun fell down a narrow street and burst into silver where a jar spilled water. A boy ran with a basket, and a man stepped aside without looking down. Women spoke with their hands, while words did little. Joseph's breathing matched the pace of the place without speeding or slowing, the way a heart behaves when it accepts a new season. In a square where the wind struggled to enter, voices rose in trades that held no anger, only long practice. A man with eyes like polished copper measured Joseph without apology. Another man spoke a name that belonged to no one in Joseph's family, and the copper-eyed one answered with a number. A tablet took a mark. The rope slackened and then tightened to face him a different direction. He looked once toward the road that had delivered him, and saw not home, only distance. Back in Canaan, Jacob went before dawn to the fold and watched the breath of beasts become cloud. He listened for the voice that had found him at ladders and rivers, and heard only the hum life makes when it refuses to quit. He set his palm on a rough post and thanked for the post, then for light thin as thread, then for a son's laughter that kept echoing where echoes were not supposed to last. He did not trade gratitude for denial. He laid it down like seed on burned ground. In Egypt, a house of white stone drew Joseph inward and returned to him the hush of shade. The air smelled of river and mortar. Hands untied the rope. Cloth he did not know was set on him. Steps learned a new courtyard. He stood with wrists stung raw and eyes open. He mistook neither survival for triumph, nor sorrow for abandonment. He let them stand side by side without argument, and refused to let either claim the last word. The dreams flickered again, not loud, not gone, waiting for their appointed hour. The city swelled and fell like tide against carved banks, and he breathed with it. He made no vows the day could break. He gave his next step to the God who had taken his unspoken prayer in a dry well. It felt like setting out a bowl to catch rain in a land that rarely sees it. Some would call it foolish. He called it living. The river kept its old discipline, and the sun laid its hands on painted walls, and then lifted them and put them down elsewhere. Somewhere a field turned green without witnesses. Somewhere in a tent far from stone and paint, a father folded a stained robe and then lifted it again, because repetition comforts when answers refuse to come. Between those places lines of patience and mercy drew patterns no eye could trace. Joseph lived inside that work without seeing it and remained. He accepted bread that had been cut with care and a jar placed within reach, noted the clay's color so the night would not steal it, watched the hand of the man who now owned him, and found not cruelty, only rank. He let that be the first mercy under a new sky. Evening leaned across the walls, and a soft wind rose from the water. He closed his eyes for a breath, opened them, and kept looking, because attention itself can be a prayer without a word. Morning would come again, and he would look again. The story of beginnings had been written, and the story of loss as well. Now endurance opened its first page like a seed splitting quietly in the dark. Far away, a father learned to walk with weight, and far ahead doors no eye had drawn would open into rooms no one expected. He could not yet see that light, but travelers do not need to see the end to take the next step. In the space between memory and expectation, with the ghost of rope still on skin and the stubborn wisdom of breath entering a body that had been thrown down and lifted again, he stood. The dream did not need a coat to live. It lived where cloth cannot be torn, in the unseen patience of God, patient enough to wait for harvest.